Now we are going to move on to the Lab 12 lecture. This is going to be about Neanderthals and the genus Homo. We've already talked about primitive and derived traits, but this is a little bit refresher if you guys need that. Moving on to the genus Homo, we have a couple of species of Homo ancestors. There is Homo ergaster. They were around 1.9 to 1.4 million years ago. Homo erectus, which were around 1.89 million years ago to about 110,000 years ago. Homo heidelbergensis, they were around 700 to 200,000 years ago. Homo neanderthalensis, which were around 400 to 40,000 years ago. And then Homo sapiens, which were around about 300,000 years ago to present day. However, recent discoveries are and updates to carbon dating and other techniques are kind of pushing our ideas of when Homo neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens kind of existed back a little bit. So they may have been older than what is shown here, but these are a pretty good estimate that is widely accepted in the anthropological community. Now, sometimes early Homo sapiens will be called anatomically modern Homo sapiens, or AMHS. This is partially to differentiate because really early Homo sapiens and then modern, like today, Homo sapiens do look slightly different. However, we refer to them as anatomically modern because there is kind of a line between kind of this early transitional Homo sapien and when they start to look more like a modern day Homo sapien, just in terms of the physical characteristics of the skeleton. So Homo erectus, they had pretty modern human-like body proportions, so elongated legs and shorter arms compared to their torsos. The typecast for this is the Chicana boy. And they had a cranial capacity of less than 1,000 cubic centimeters. They also still have slightly larger kind of megadont teeth than modern humans, but it's not as extreme as the Paranthropines. By the time we get to Homo neanderthalensis, we can see that the cranial capacity has gotten larger. However, despite being the closest relative to anatomically modern humans, or Homo sapiens, they were actually much shorter and stockier. They also had a large midface, an angled zygomatic arch, large supraorbital ridge or brow bone, and then a very wide and large nose. And these shorter, stockier bodies, these wider noses, all of that is actually due to the fact that they were living in colder regions during the Ice Age. And all of these characteristics kind of help to preserve heat and keep them warm in those locations. So they were very specialized for that kind of Ice Age, cold region, and they did fairly well. Now, their brain capacity was actually 1,500 cubic centimeters, which is larger than modern humans. The big difference, though, you can see that they have a much smaller kind of prefrontal cortex region there than modern humans do. So despite them actually having a larger brain case, they weren't necessarily as intelligent as modern humans. Now that doesn't mean that Homo Neanderthals were stupid. They weren't just like cavemen beating their chests like they're often depicted in, different forms of media. We can assume that they had language. Language doesn't really preserve well. Tongues don't preserve and all of that kind of stuff that are really important to being able to speak. But we can assume based off of their societal structures and the actual material evidence that we have of them, they did speak, they had some sort of language. We also know that they, used fire, they had very complicated tool sets. They took care of the sick and the old. They also had kind of more ritualistic burial practices. They made jewelry, they painted things, they made different forms of art. And you can see they have that larger brow ridge than Homo sapiens. The Homo sapien is on the left, by the way. Their jaws are quite a bit larger, they project a little bit more. Their teeth are wider and thicker. They still have a little bit of this kind of occipital bun in the back of their head. And then their nasal bones project more as well. Now, Homo sapiens, we actually have a lighter build than all prior Homo species. So we are smaller overall, although we do tend to be taller. The modern Homo sapien also has a brain capacity of about 1,300 cc's. Actual skulls themselves are very thin-walled. We have a higher vaulted skull, so it's taller, and a much more near vertical forehead because of that prefrontal cortex becoming larger. We also have smaller brow ridges and less prognathism, so there's a lot less sexual dimorphism in Homo sapiens than in other early Homo species. And then we have smaller jaws and teeth because at this point we are eating much more kind of cooked and processed food. It's softer. Also, Neanderthals, a larger part of their diet was made up of meat, which is tougher. Homo sapiens were kind of getting the jump on cultivating and like growing different vegetables and fruits and cooking our meat to where it was tender. So we just didn't need those super strong jaws and teeth. Here you can see this is the out of Africa theory. Here on the right-hand side, you can see kind of the regions of Neanderthals and Denisovans. Denisovans were more recently discovered, but they existed around the same time as Neanderthals and very early Homo sapiens. Some people think that they are just kind of a subspecies of Neanderthal that shows some differences due to, adapting to their particular environment. However, it's more commonly thought that they are just kind of a separate species. They were more closely related to Neanderthals, and they definitely kind of crossbred between the two of them more than they did with early Homo sapiens. But that also makes sense because they were in those regions near each other longer before Homo sapiens kind of made their way out of Africa. This does kind of touch on this theory between these splitters and lumpers in anthropology, and this is kind of this idea that Neanderthals should be called either Homo neanderthalensis if you are a splitter, so they are not a direct ancestor of Homo sapiens, or if you are a lumper and you think that they should be considered Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. The reason that this is such an issue is because we obviously shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals. However, Neanderthals migrated out of Africa a lot sooner than early Homo sapiens did. And despite the fact that there is evidence that we have interbred, modern populations, especially if you are more Caucasian or, have more European ancestry, we tend to have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Now, obviously, a lot of people in Asia have a little bit more Denisovan DNA. And then people that have stayed in Africa have more early Homo sapien DNA, less of that Neanderthal and Denisovan, if they have any of it at all. But the problem with them being able to interbreed is that we commonly think of a species as any group of organisms that can interbreed and create viable offspring. And Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did create viable offsprings, or else we wouldn't still have that DNA. So it kind of begs that question of whether or not we should consider them the same species, or, you know, with having them as like a subspecies, or if we consider them completely separate species because of the characteristics and physical differences between the groups, and then also that length of time that we were separated and evolved to our individual environments. Here on the left, you can see this kind of known range of Neanderthals. You should watch this video, The Migration Out of Africa. And by the way, plenty of people still like to argue the out of Africa hypothesis that, early Homo sapiens and all other early human ancestors migrated out of Africa, and that Africa is kind of the birthplace of humanity. You can argue it, but the fossil record, historical documentation, and like folklore, as well as newer DNA evidence, all support this theory. And it is what is considered true for anthropology. So you can argue it. You just won't necessarily, have a lot of followers. Moving on, we have stone tools. Now, stone tools are a really good way to kind of tell how a species thought, how intelligent they might have been, and also what their environment was like based off of the material that they used and the tools that they felt were necessary to make. Now, the first stone tool technology that we see is Oldowan. This is that first photo there that kind of just looks like a chipped rock. That's because it's a very simple stone tool technology. It has some flakes and some choppers, and it's associated with early Homo, so about 2.6 to 1.7 BP. And these are just like slightly modified rocks. Then we move on and we get a little bit more sophisticated with the Acheulean stone tool technology. This is this middle photo there. These are going to be flakes and bifacial tools, including hand axes. This is the first time we start to see hand axes, which were used for digging as well as cutting. And these are associated with Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, so about 1.6 to 0.13 million years ago. And you can see these kind of look more like what we traditionally think of as like an arrowhead with the flakes and kind of percussion strikes. And then we move on to the Mousterian stone tool technology. Now this is associated with Homo neanderthalensis, so about 160,000 to 40,000 BP. These are going to be smaller stone flakes or blades. They have longer edges. They're made through a process that more effectively and efficiently produces sharp edges, as well as flakes that are kind of given shape from a core. So Neanderthals had a very wide kind of stone tool technology going on. They were making flakes, they were making hand axes, they were making bifacial points, so they were sharpening both sides, but they were also doing it much more efficiently. So instead of just taking one rock and kind of beating it into the shape you wanted, they would take the rock or the core and create like a larger tool from that, the smaller flakes that came off would then be refined to make them into other tools as well. So we aren't just wasting and throwing away the bits, we're actually turning them into their own tools that are for much more precise uses. This is also when we start to see more bone tools being used, like bone needles. And some of these points are better for actually like chopping down a tree or digging in the dirt. Some of them are better for actually butchering meat. Others are more precise for tanning hides, for actually cutting that hide off without destroying it. And then some of them are used to make other tools out of wood and bone. Now you should also watch this video. It's called Moving Out of Africa, not to be confused with the Migration Out of Africa. They are two different videos. Now, this is all that I have for you today. Please do not forget to sign up for your primate. Start working on that project that is coming up sooner than you think.